Craig is a PhD from UC Berkeley, worked with a number of terrific people at Berkeley, and then took a job as an assistant professor at Syracuse University in New York. Craig then joined the faculty at the University of Oregon in 2004, where he is an assistant professor. Craig's published a ton of work on European politics, and in particular has focused on the important role of ideas and ideas about Europe, and in particular in the early and formative years of the European Union. His first book was from Cornell University Press, which actually won the Alger Prize for the best book on international organizations. And it was in fact called A Certain Idea of Europe. And focused on his argument that the way in which European policymakers of the 50s conceived of the options open to them, these sort of cultural ideas, had a big influence on the actual choices that they made, again, in the 1950s. And that those choices, in turn, have a big influence on the way the European Union is today. Now, the talk he's going to give us today is going to focus much more on contemporary issues inside the EU. The talk is called The European Constitution and the Trouble with Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Craig Parsons.
Thank you, Wade, and thank you all. I'm actually, with the approval of the authorities, going to not use this. I like to shout. The last time I used a microphone, people complained that it was painful. So if people can't hear me, though, let me know. Wave your arms or something. You want me to use it? Oh, because you're recording. Oh, boy. Posterity. Okay, fine. I reserve the right to wander about and gesticulate. In any case, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Wade, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here on this beautiful fall day. I've never been to Provo before, and I'm frankly stunned at how beautiful it is. And I'm stunned at the turnout for the talk, so thanks for coming. What I'm going to talk about is the thing that's been in the news, this European Constitution, and in particular, my greatest expertise is in French politics and French thinking about the EU. And, of course, the French no vote on this European Constitution at the end of May of this year was this sort of earthquake shock in European politics. And I want to talk about why that vote went the way it did, and then also more broadly about some issues of democracy that stand behind that vote. So first, start out, though, with some background stuff, since I certainly don't assume that everybody knows what in the world the EU is. Many people in the EU don't know what in the world it is. Very broadly speaking, okay, it is, people quibble about it. It started out as this international organization thing. It would seem to be in a category like the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund or one of these international things. It has, over time, taken on so much scope and authority that anybody who knows what they're talking about basically admits that it is much more like a weak federal government over 25 countries in Western Europe than anything else. Okay, it is a federal polity. It's one of the weaker federal polities out there in the world of federal polities like the United States and Germany and Switzerland and Canada and blah, blah, blah. But it's a federal polity. And it's got big buildings. It's got a flag. It's got money. Okay. It has this guy, Jose Manuel Barroso, who is the head of the European Commission, which is more or less, with various caveats, its executive body. It has a three-branched government system that will be familiar to any American, with this executive thing, the European Commission, broadly speaking, a roughly bicameral legislature, with a thing that's sort of like a Senate, the Council of Ministers, a European Parliament, which has that very nice big building. It's the EP. It actually has two such buildings, which is a huge story of waste and fraud. So it has a European Parliament. It has a court that is more like our Supreme Court than almost any other court in the world. And now what it does a ton of things. Mostly what it does, I hope you can all see this little corner of the slide, maybe you can't, it says EU tasks, money, regulation, but little tax and spend. Okay, so the EU runs Europe's money. Not all the member states are in on the euro yet, but there are various caveats, but you get the point. it runs regulation, okay, a ton of regulation on everything, sort of the basic rules of how to do business in Europe, and business very broadly construed. What it doesn't do much of is tax and spend. There's not a whole lot of that classic thing that governments ostensibly do, gather some money from the people and take them up and then to spread it around somewhere else. Okay, and that will come back. Okay, that's our broad background. Now, getting a little closer to our actual subject, the broad background on this European Constitution thing. In 2003-2004, there was this thing called the Convention on the Future of Europe. It was 105 people who got together, including representatives of governments, representatives of those various EU institutions I mentioned, Commission, Parliament, blah, 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 and a few sort of wise men, random types, who came together for the purpose of negotiating some changes to the treaties around which the European Union is built. Okay, those treaties, the original treaty that is in some sense sort of still there was signed in 1957, and it's been modified a whole bunch of times since then. Each time it's been modified previously, it was done behind closed doors in a classic international negotiation, where the governments who are in on this deal got together, just their private representatives essentially, and figured out what they were willing to sign on to. This Convention on the Future of Europe was a new format, but with the same point of tinkering with what the EU is about. I'll speak to why they chose this format in just a second. But in terms of the details, so what happened was you get these great thinkers. They come together, they put a bunch of stuff on the table, and they try and rough out a new version of the EU treaties. Okay, and they called it a constitution. Okay, but it's a treaty. Okay, and now we're going to get into some issues about what is a constitution. But what then happened? Now, it wasn't that these people did not have the power to then decree that this was indeed the modifications to the EU treaties and that this thing was now in force. Instead, after they were done talking, it was a relatively surprising success. They made their way to a document that, by the processes they agreed upon, they agreed upon. Okay. Then, however, those national governments, okay, who we think of them, they're roughly analogous to states in the U.S. context, then reserve the right, however, to have their own round of bargaining on that text in more classic international negotiation sort of way. Okay, so essentially the convention was drawn together to propose a draft constitution. And then it was going to go through, and it did go through, the same process that all the previous tinkerings with the treaties had gone through, which was essentially governments withdrew behind closed doors and worked out some deals on what they were actually willing to commit to. Okay, so that's our process. We get to this constitution thing. These latter negotiations among the member states totally failed at one point, and then they worked it out again, and they finally agreed on what amounted to a surprisingly small modification of what the convention had proposed. So that most of what the convention suggested survived. Okay, now, why such a big deal? Then this, I suspect some of you are here because this discussion of a European constitution seems really exciting and has gotten a ton of media attention, not just in Europe, but across the world. Now, here I'm going to burst your bubble a little bit. Mostly it's a big deal because Euro enthusiasts really wanted to make it a big deal, but not for more substantive reasons than that. Essentially, the notion was this whole EU thing had been set up and had been given quite a lot of power over a long period of time, 50 years. And the people, or the peoples, depending on how you see it, in Europe, had felt increasingly marginalized or just they hadn't really been given the opportunity to participate in a series of decisions that were increasingly affecting them. And part of the problem was the fact that the EU had been created and then tinkered with in these closed-door international negotiations. And so the notion was, from the sort of Europhile types who hang out around Brussels, that this would be this grand discussion. Okay, finally, everybody's going to get together. We're going to throw open the doors. Europeans of all stripes are going to come out and argue about what should be in a European constitution. And this would rally support in a variety of ways, and everybody would feel great about the EU. Okay, now, you could retell everything I just said as a sort of cynical propaganda, sort of public relations ploy. Okay, and most people do, actually. Substantively, in terms of the result of this constitution that came out of the two-stage process I mentioned, there weren't actually that many changes. Okay, largely this was a codification, a restating and a little bit of cleaning up of the EU treaties that had been the product of all those closed-door negotiations over the years. There were a couple substantive changes. More widespread majority voting in the roughly Senate-like body, the Council of Ministers. So this Council of Ministers, I'm not going to get into the horrible institutional details of the EU, although I welcome questions about them. But essentially, they were like a Senate, but that had unanimous voting on an awful lot of issues. And over time, they've gradually extended majority voting to more and more issues. As you can imagine, a Senate with unanimous voting on most things, the things that the unanimous voting is on, you don't pass a whole lot of things. And so this is very important that the Constitution, essentially with exceptions for taxation and foreign policy, the Constitution was going to make majority voting the rule for Council of Ministers decision-making. And that's important. There was a plan for a European foreign minister position and staff for that person, and that was a pretty tangible upgrade in the institutional commitment and likelihood of rallying together European foreign policy cooperation. And then there's this thing that had already actually been on the books but did not have official legal force, the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That was drawn up in the late 1990s. The Constitution gave it legal force, made it sort of the Bill of Rights for the whole EU. It did not represent massive changes on the rights that are enshrined in all the national constitutions in Europe, although, of course, in 1,000 little tiny ways, it was different from any one of them. And arguably, had this Constitution passed, and of course now we're going to get into the sad story of its failure, it probably would have had some long-term institutional consequences. Okay, as we know, we Americans, you write something in your Constitution, down the line it might come back to do something. Okay, now, jump to the fun part. And I'm going to talk mostly about the French referendum. The Dutch, just a few days after the French rejected the Constitution, the Dutch did so as well by an even larger vote. But it really was the French vote that shocked the world. France, having been not just one of the core and original members of this EU project, but certainly in their own minds and even in the minds of some other people, the core member. In the sense, at least, that if the French had not agreed to anything at any point in the whole EU process, any of the big deals, then it wasn't going to happen. Okay, French assent has always been crucial. You can say the same thing about Germany, although actually with a few more caveats. The French certainly, the first question an EU watcher would ask about big deals historically is, are the French going to go along with this? That is a good shorthand to, is something does it have any chance of flying? Okay, now what you get then in this referendum at the end of May is about a 55% no vote, which is fairly substantial as no votes in referenda go around the world, and a pretty high turnout as well. About 70%, that's about the same as some presidential elections in France. Higher, a good deal higher than any other referenda in modern French history, with the exception of the other referendum on EU issues, the 1992 referendum on the Maastricht Treaty, which was roughly similar turnout. So a lot of mobilization and a fairly clear no. This shocks Europe because the French, in addition to being, as I was saying, sort of the obligatory at the very least, the obligatory assent vote to anything that's going to happen in the EU. they had also been the leader. I mean, they had been in the enthusiastic pushing role for many, many years. And so to have them say no seemed to, and indeed has, augured the end of this. Essentially, the Constitution was effectively set aside that day. There was a little bit of quibbling about, is there any way to resurrect it? Can we work around this in any way? But pretty clear. Certainly the Dutch vote a little thereafter put the last nail in the coffin. But it was pretty much that this was sufficient in and of itself. Okay. Now, what did the French referendum campaign then look like? The most salient themes of opposition were two, really. And probably not just probably, by far the biggest was that the EU is too free market oriented. Okay, essentially the EU, which is indeed its core task, as I mentioned, is regulatory, and as a regulatory body, what it's been doing to regulation in Europe for quite some time now is basically liberalizing, getting rid of national barriers, and creating a single market and eventually a single money to go along with it. The French have a history of skepticism about the market as a people. It's very, very hard to find true free marketeers in French politics, even on the right. Okay, they are a relatively rare species. And so what you heard in this referendum was that the EU of 2005 was this giant monster undercutting the values of French society. In particular, the enlargement of the EU to Eastern Europe the previous year in 2004 had brought a bunch of much poorer countries with lower levels of regulation, less generous welfare states, and much cheaper labor. And so now the French were being thrown into this mix with these countries who were going to undercut through competition all the things that the French had fought for centuries since the Revolution. The symbol of this was this Polish plumber that became part of, there wasn't any real Polish plumber, but it became this symbolic reference of the notion being that this Polish plumber would come and through the various EU rules you could pay the Polish plumber in France like a Polish plumber, and the employer costs would be lower to pay for the lower benefits of the welfare state in Poland and everything, and that person would thus completely undercut the poor deserving, hardworking, well-qualified French plumbers. Okay, and the plumbers, and as soon as plumbing was out the door, we all know how important plumbing is. This was one huge theme. The other big theme, a little harder to summarize, was that the EU, with this enlargement in 2004 and then with the prospect of further enlargements, was getting too big. It was erasing one of the original French, and then not just French, goals for what this EU thing was about, which was that not just to get rid of barriers to trade and create a bigger market, but to actually take these small and medium-sized countries and put their efforts and power together and enable them to speak in a world, to have more impact on a world where there were a lot of bigger players, notably the United States. There used to be this thing called the Soviet Union, no longer a problem, but China, India, pick your favorite big country. So that in this Europe of 25 that now exists as of 2004, and even worse, from the viewpoint of many of these French people, a Europe of, say, 30, and in particular including the very large and quite different country, Turkey, that essentially both in terms just logistically of could you really have a common foreign policy and a voice in the world, period, across such a big and heterogeneous bunch, and even more important perhaps to the French, would the French voice be an important part of that common policy? These two things both seemed to be heading out. Okay, and so you get these two themes as the kinds of concerns that people are talking about, why they don't like the EU, and if you give them a shot at expressing themselves on a European constitution, they may well vote no for either of these reasons. Now we get to the interesting and weird part. The thing is that those themes hardly connect at all to the actual vote. The vote itself was and those themes as well are not very closely related to the actual text of the Constitution. If you look at the Constitution in terms of what it changed relative to the status quo of the EU, those few substantive changes I mentioned earlier, if anything, probably shifted the EU a little bit back away from a free market Europe. Those extensions of majority voting in the Council of Ministers would have included majority voting in things like social policy, which would have created the possibility of more, at least some more, policy agreement in anti-market areas. Free or majority voting had already been basically established in all sort of liberalizing regulatory areas. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to oppose. You can complain about the EU as being too free market, but to vote against this constitution because you don't like the free market was a weird thing to do. Similarly, if your thing was that the EU, we had this dream of an EU foreign policy that the French would be able to lead, and that seems to be weakening, it was a really weird thing to vote against the Constitution on that basis because it was literally the only document in the history of the EU that had really taken a big, tangible step towards making a common foreign policy. This creation of a European foreign minister was seen by foreign policy types who hover around Brussels as a really, really important step. With all sorts of caveats, it wouldn't exactly have delivered a marvelously centralized foreign policy suddenly, but it was, everybody agreed who works on these issues, pretty important. So that was weird. Now, okay, take this back in further historical perspective. If you just look at who voted for, when do French people vote for and against the EU when they're asked these things? Okay, so we had a previous referendum that I mentioned in 1992, one of the earlier modifications to the EU treaties, the Maastricht Treaty, which was the one that created the single currency deal, had a referendum in France. And in that one, okay, now, the weird thing is that the French left votes largely for the Maastricht Treaty referendum, and the right votes mostly against. They're both divided, but the larger chunks fall that way. The Maastricht Treaty, as I mentioned, created the single currency, which is viewed by people who do economic policy as essentially a pretty orthodox, rigorous, conservative, certainly in no interpretation, leftish sort of policy. So here, the previous time they'd been asked to vote on an EU issue, they were asked to vote on something of which the major substantive element was conservative in historical perspective, economically speaking. But the left votes mostly for it and the right mostly against. In this referendum, as I argued, this constitution, if anything, moved things a little bit back in a less free market direction, but now the left votes against this one mostly, and the right a little bit more for. So, now where does this leave us? It leaves us at what I'm afraid is a highly uninteresting, but don't worry, I'm going to expand on it in interesting ways. Interesting, immediate conclusion. This was very largely a protest vote against the crappy bunch of leaders that France has right now, and that's not just my opinion, that's their opinion, and generally what are perceived as bad times in France. Okay, so what do we see that indicates this besides these disconnects, the substantive disconnects that I pointed to? What you see, okay, so the yes vote was polling over 60% until March 2005. Okay, the referendum is in May. And it goes precipitously down, drops about 15 points. And what happens in March? There are a bunch of scandals. French finance minister had too fancy an apartment. A bunch of court cases begin against the cronies of the president Jacques Chirac, basically relating to when he had been mayor of Paris and had steered public contracts and apartments in various improper ways. And so you get these scandals. And so with a further drop in the popularity of the current leadership, you get this precipitous drop in support for the Constitution. Now, it's important to mention also that Jacques Chirac, the president, had been calling for a yes vote here. Okay, so there's a reason to link the two. But again, that's an awfully thin thing to be voting on, given these sort of substantive disconnects. Then there's this sort of general malaise, 76% of French people in May 2005 said that things are getting worse. It's hard, any of you, if you've been to France in say the last year or two, but it's a longer term thing, the sense of general malaise is striking. And this was only much worsened after this referendum. But really, it's extremely negative about their place in the world, the way the world is going, etc. So I get to this point in my talk, and so what I've told you is there's this interesting thing, the EU, they had this constitutional thing, people tried to attract a lot of attention to it, it didn't change a whole lot, and then there was a vote that didn't have anything to do with it that killed it. Okay, weird story. There's a somewhat more interesting background to this. Oh, wait. Sorry, I need to tell you one more thing before I get to my segue to the big thoughts. And so, because I had mentioned this, what's up with the left voting for the Maastricht Treaty and the right voting for this more recent referendum. Essentially, the left was in power in 1992. And so if you're going to have a protest vote, what you tend to see is whoever identifies with the opposition comes out massively in protest. Okay, so what do you know? The right votes massively against Maastricht, even though in the abstract you might have thought that they would have some substantive reasons to like that treaty. But again, they're not voting on the substantive reasons. Similarly, this one, the left comes out pretty massively and votes against this referendum because it's the right that's in power right now, and not for any of the other substantive calculations about whether they like this deal. Okay, now back to my big thoughts and segue. This story about a protest vote, you could just write it off and say, okay, this is depressing, but this is what we constantly find about a lot of things in democracies, that people don't know much about the issues. They're generally ignorant. And maybe they know a little about the issues, but it turns out to be things that aren't really their positions on the issues that lead them to vote in certain ways. There is a massive and very depressing literature on that subject. Nonetheless, that sort of begs the question, both from a sort of empirical and then a sort of theoretical sense. Empirically, there was an extraordinary debate in France of the highest imaginable quality in modern democracies that happened in March, April, May of this year. To the point that, okay, you had very substantial media coverage, which was not the rule prior to this on EU issues. You had books selling, several of them, vast discursuses on this EU constitution, selling hundreds of thousands of copies, okay, which that doesn't happen. You had, a couple weeks before the vote, 80% of the people said that they had discussed at home the Constitution. That's the kind of figure you get when the country's at war or something. Okay, so, and really, the tenor of the debate was as rich, in a deliberative sense, this was as good as it could get in a modern democracy. And yet, when they actually go to the polls, it seems to look like a protest vote. So why is this marvelous debate so disconnected? Not as much as there's all this literature on democracy that says there's a lot of protest votes out there. Nobody says that everything is a protest vote. There are some things in modern democracies where people have some views and they're connected to some parties and they feel represented, and something like the way we think democracy is supposed to work works a little bit. Okay, and so there's a question begged about why such a massive disconnect, and again, especially in light of the magnificent debate that preceded the referendum. Why does it seem to connect so little and sort of leave the actual decisions to just sort of simple protest thrust? Okay, here I get into I sort of move towards the conclusion with some giant theoretical thoughts. And this is the second half of the title of the talk, The Trouble with Democracy. So I think, and I'm working this out, and it's sort of a brainstorm, so bear with me, that you get a protest vote like this because the normal workings of French politics literally cannot formulate the kind of debate we would like to see in a modern democracy on EU issues. The mainstream parties in France, everybody except the extremes to either side, have been very deeply split over EU issues for the last 50 years. Okay, and my first book, A Certain Idea of Europe, was basically extrapolated a whole bunch of things out of that simple argument. That all of these parties on both right and left have been really, really deeply divided. Now, the issues in question are similar to what we think of in the U.S. as federalism or states' rights issues, essentially about how much power and over what do you delegate to the federal, the EU level. Okay. So what happens, essentially, 50 years ago, the right and left in France, and to a lesser extent in other countries, but still the pattern is there, fragment over these new issues of how much power to give to federal institutions. And then whenever a policy decision comes up where they're tinkering with these treaties, deciding on something more to do with this EU framework, the parties either fall apart in disarray, or actually more frequently, they smother the debates. They impose explicit decisions not to talk about it. They move it off screen. They talk about something else. They employ a whole lot of fairly standard political moves to avoid talking about something that divides you from your important allies. Okay. Now, that's just a little bit of the summary of sort of what has happened. What's going on behind that? I think this is not something weird about France. And it's not something weird about this weird EU. The EU is plenty weird, but this thing is not actually just an EU property. It's actually a little noticed aspect of democracy. And so let me now take you fully into a theoretical world. We are taught, basically, in your high school civics class, that democracy is perfect. It's the best system to represent heterogeneous societies. Everybody goes out and they call for whatever they want and they ally with whomever they want and they get people to run who will do what they want. And we all have a great big competition and somebody wins and the majority gets to dictate what's going on. But consider, I think, theoretically speaking, we should not expect that to happen. Consider three simple points. Okay, first point is pluralism. Those of you who have done a little political science may have heard this term. The notion of pluralism is simply the notion of multidimensional societies. That is, a pluralist view of modern society is that there are a bunch of issues out there and they don't line up in terms of who wants what. Okay, pluralists historically essentially evolved as an argument against Marxism, which said all modern societies are divided into two big groups, more or less the rich and the poor, who are always trying to fight it out. And pluralists said, no, it's not that simple. There are a bunch of cross-cutting issues out there, and modern societies, thus, the whole thing about modern societies is that they have all these different issues running through them that do not line up. Okay, so take pluralism. It seems to me that pluralists were right and Marxists were largely wrong about that. Now, take the basic rules of electoral democracy. What do? We get together and we elect some people. In a presidential election, you're electing one person, or you're voting in some systems for a party. Either way, you're electing people to multifunctional office. Okay, sort of on one day you go somewhere, express a choice, and there are tons of different voting rules to do this. But you express a choice, and you vote for people to take up offices that have power across a whole bunch of issues. We don't have much. There's some of it, local water boards and things like this, but most powerful offices in modern democracies are not defined functionally. They are sort of across the board. So the offices lump together issues. Interestingly, you can get into office. So let's say there are a bunch of issues out there, but if there is a clear majority on one issue, of course, you can win an election on it if you manage somehow to define the election around that. And then, in principle, now you have authority on a bunch of other issues on which you may not have had, and you may not be representative of a majority. And there are all sorts of interesting political science things about how also you can win an election even if you don't represent a majority on any issue. If you think of a whole bunch of little majorities, all these different people who care about whatever they care about, and these people, and they all have different priorities. So let's say you have a minority position on all these different issues. but your minority positions are the first priority of a whole bunch of people out there. They will decide to vote for you, and you can cobble together a bunch of different minorities and then win multifunctional office without actually any majority wanting any of your policies. Okay, that's a slightly extreme case, but it's relevant to where I'm going. Okay, so the point here is that if you buy pluralism, and most modern theorists of democracy do, if you think about these multifunctional offices, you should expect that they're... So maybe we're not going to see these situations where somebody gets into power without representing a majority on anything. But it should be fairly regular that they're able to get into power and are distinctly not representative of a majority on some issue. But they are given the institutional authority to push their position on that policy. Okay, add one other thing into this, and I really am going to wrap this up quickly. The notion of parties as sticky institutions. Okay, this is another poli-sci theory sort of thing. Sticky institutions, the basic notion is once you set up an organization with rules and people sitting in offices and the ways things are done, there's some costs to changing it. And so institutions are sticky. They in and of themselves, they are difficult to alter. And so if you set up party politics around certain issues, what happens? People they learn that in order to have a political career, you need to take a stand on this versus that. They affiliate with certain networks. They develop discourse and ways of talking to journalists and the people that use certain tag phrases that make it all comprehensible. They create networks for raising money. They do all these things that are built around certain fights. Okay. Then if you get into another cross-cutting fight, you have a bunch of reasons for avoiding those issues. Okay, that is to say, you have built a party or a coalition around certain issues. You're used to getting your money because people think you represent certain points of view. And if another cross-cutting fight comes along, you're in this difficult position of your normal allies, some of the normal people who give you money and have supported you, are on the other side of this fight. Okay, and so the point here, if you add it all up, if you add this all up, we should expect cross-cutting cleavages. We should expect people to get into office without being fully representative majorities on a bunch of important issues. And once you set up party systems, they get built around certain issues, and if other issues come along that are cross-cutting, it's going to be hard. There are going to be incentives to smother them or avoid them. Okay. Now, back to the EU and the trouble with democracy there. I think the big story of EU politics, part of it is just voter ignorance, and you get a protest vote because not everybody is quite as fabulous as normative democratic theorists would like them to be. But again, this begs the question of why is democracy sort of left open to a protest vote on this? The EU is a particularly acute version of this cross-cutting issue problem. European parties were built in the 19th and 20th centuries largely around right-left cleavages. Okay, you'd need to add a bunch of caveats about that in each country, and what right and left mean in each country is a little different, but right-left is the main line. As of the 1950s, as this EU project is getting going, it comes to cross-cut right-left issues. Why? I have a hard time figuring out. Although just intellectually speaking, different positions on how much power you should give to European institutions, you can come up with various right or left arguments either way. Okay, so all these people who had previously thought of themselves as right or left politicians, they don't know which way to go, and for a bunch of idiosyncratic reasons, they begin to divide. This is especially true in France, where, as I claimed, there's this remarkable divide on both right and left on these European issues. So, over time, partisan coalitions very explicitly shun or obscure, they sort of paper over these divisions they have around EU issues. Elections, political careers, coalition building continue to operate on right-left issues. This is as true today as it was in 1950. But the important policy decisions, once any of these people get elected into office, the most important things they've been deciding on are things like the single currency, how much power to give the EU on this or that. The EU, these European issues, have turned out to be the most important issues that people are asked to decide on once they get into power on the basis of their right or left positions. And so whenever we get these referenda, you see sort of fragmentation of right and left. You see sort of this flare-up of debate. But the normal people are sort of left unmoored. Even if you give them the information, and there's some sort of clear options as, I thought I had another point there. Well, anyway, even in this magnificent debate that happened in the spring of 2005, when it comes to voting, they are not plugged into their usual networks. When they can't bring themselves, the right ultimately, a little more of them come and say, the right's in power, I'm not going to use my chance to screw that up, because we know that power continues to operate on right-left, and I do care about that. And similarly, the left more or less says, there's no cost, I have some thoughts about the Constitution, but there's not much cost. This is a good time to stick it to them, those right people in power. Okay, now, is there any hope to close? This is not a happy story. So not only is this a protest vote, and protests vote are not something that democratic theorists get real happy about, but what I'm arguing is that behind this, even if people were really well informed, if everybody was sort of on the up and up, the leaders were trying to do the right thing, we shouldn't expect electoral democracy to represent well when you get these cross-cutting issues. There are going to be big trade-offs if the issue landscape cross-cuts itself. And there's no easy solution. I would love someone to ask me a question about the British case. Okay, so I said in an aside, other countries, not quite so sharply as France, but other countries in Europe also have this cross-cutting right-left versus European issues pattern. Britain has the only major party in Europe that has arguably become has shifted to be an anti-European party more than a right party, the Conservative Party there. And they have shredded themselves and fallen apart. For reasons that my story can explain, if you want to hear about that. Anyway, this happens elsewhere. So it's really a very depressing story that people are relatively ignorant and don't do what we'd like them to do anyway. But even if they weren't, unfortunately, there are reasons to suspect electoral democracy shouldn't play out the way we would hope. Now, the EU, I think, could develop less conflicted politics if we could somehow close the gap between these big cross-cutting issues. If active choices on federalism issues recede, if they're no longer being asked to pronounce on federalism issues, then you could sort of go back to a fight that's basically about right-left questions, and that's fairly likely. The EU is arguably at the end of its blueprint. We are at the end of a time when big decisions are to be made about the increasing delegation of powers to the European level, and so this might sort of recede into the past. Another thing that could happen is if those tax and spend responsibilities that are the meat of right-left debates moved up to the European level. Remember, I started out by saying that what the EU doesn't do much of is tax and spend. If the EU took on big things like social policy, then presumably our good old, well-developed parties at the national level that are formed around right and left issues, they would suddenly now have something that they could debate about and be comfortable about and have their normal constituencies and money networks and everything else. And so you might get a more coherent democratic politics that way. Those things are actually sort of contradictory, since the second one would involve more decisions on federalism. So we'll have to think about that. But anyway, the bigger message, unfortunately, is democracy everywhere is a little worse than we thought. Okay, the version of this paper, a more theoretical one that I can talk about tomorrow with the political science department, is called "How the EU Shows That Democracy Doesn't Work." And that's a little provocative, but the point is this particularly acute case of important cross-cutting issues has stalemated democracy in Europe. The bottom line, does that mean I don't like democracy? No. Churchill still has it right. that democracy is the worst system except for all the others. It's just a little worse than he thought. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Craig. I think we have about 5 or 6 minutes for some questions. Unless Connor leaps out of the back room with a microphone in his hand, I'm just going to assume that you can ask the questions. Oh, there is a microphone right there. Okay, so if you just want to raise your hand, Craig will let you take your own questions. Great. Please. They have to do this to be able to record it.
Right.
Okay, my question is, when it gets down to the point where you say there's these cross-cutting issues and then like an EU question comes up and it's not split right-left, so it's complicated, is the problem that the parties can't push a position so that people can't know which way to follow? I just don't know what the causal follow-through there is.
Yes, well, so the problem is slightly different sort of historically versus this particular debate on the referendum. Historically speaking, so as a pattern over the last 50 years in France and more or less elsewhere as well. So you get a big decision to be made about some treaty proposal at the European level that involves some substantial delegation of new powers. The people who are in power, whoever they are, right or left, didn't get into power because they had taken a clear position on that. Okay, and their actively governing partners are split. Okay, this is just how it has shaken out. Thus, they have a bunch of incentives to not have that fight publicly. And so, exactly as you suggested, you don't get them talking to the media. So the media has a hard time figuring out what the policy options are. You don't, and often, and this is even more the case in the Netherlands than in France, often you get all the mainstream parties sort of locking down in these vague pro-European statements that obscure what they're actually doing behind the scenes. And so there's very little information in the media. The media, being given no good fights to talk about, doesn't talk about it. Even the lower ranks of actual party rank and file, members of the party, not just people out, normal voters, don't know what in the world to think. And if they do think something, they're divided too. Okay, so the longer-term pattern is indeed sort of a muffling, even as it was clear to everyone that the delegation of power that was going to the EU was getting more and more important for everybody in sort of tangible daily life. The euro being the most obvious. Once the money changes to a different system, everybody's like, that seems important. But so you had this muffling over a long period of time. In the referendum, I certainly can't argue that things were muffled. Again, this was loud, highly mobilized, tons of information out there. But it was somewhat muffled on the right. Okay, the party. What you tend to see more muffling in the party in power. Okay, because there aren't many opportunists who, in a coalition that's in power, will speak out to contradict their people who they're in power with. Whereas when you're in opposition, you don't have a whole lot necessarily to be lost by disunity, and anybody who can disagree with the official position has an incentive to do so. So the pattern is always, and certainly was in this referendum, in this case the left in France split massively and just in the messiest, nastiest conceivable way. And the French left, they're good at being messy and nasty. And so it's not so much muffling as then the voters are sort of thrown in a free-for-all. I do have to, the ignorance of the voters does have to come back into my story a little bit, right? I mean, there's a little bit of contradiction between my broad argument and the protest vote argument that ultimately, you'd hope if the cross-cutting cleavage issue was really the whole problem, then the voters would disengage from their normal affiliations. But you wouldn't get a protest vote, you just get a different vote. You get a right-left cross-cutting vote. I think that even when subjected to a lot of good information, a clear yes or no choice over a short, intensive period of time, the history of the muffling and the simple dislocation that this does to political identities, people who tend to vote for the left, people who tend to vote for the right, leaves them sort of throwing up their arms when they actually have to go in and vote, and they vote on sort of simpler protest issues. Please.
Is there a possibility in the future that there will be a conflict among the EU states themselves, such as the Civil War here in the U.S., where they break off because of desires to become that autonomous state where they do have a constitution that functions, and to leave some countries, maybe France, behind, even though they have strong ties to France?
Not a war sort of thing. Okay, and also I wouldn't say a breakup sort of thing. But the possibility for future movement of a subset of the countries to agree to things essentially outside of the EU framework that come back to, especially on foreign policy cooperation issues, I think is extremely likely. There's a lot of discussion of it now. It'll take some more visionary leaders than we've currently got on the stage, and some with more confidence in their broad domestic support. I think I would have to bet that in 20 years, something like that is extremely likely. But the French would have to be on the positive side of it. Again, there's no scenario in which Poland, Spain, and Britain do a foreign policy cooperation thing without the French. And thus, really, when I say we'd need a little more visionary leaders and it may take 20 years, everybody's always accusing me of sort of having this, it's only the French that count sort of view, and maybe I do. I've spent a little too much time in France. But basically, the question I would ask is France going to get a relatively pro-European president who has some stronger domestic support? If so, then that will happen. And when that happens, when those conditions arrive, that is when it'll happen.